us. If you are in the wrong place, now's the time to probably get out comfortably. Thank you all for attending. Please note that we are live streaming the event, and it will also be recorded on the PS21 YouTube channel. You can also follow along with the Twitter handle #Europe EU Migrant. So you can follow along on online as well. I want to very briefly introduce our speakers. To my immediate left is Rasha Elas. She's a journalist who's worked for over 10 years in the Middle East, including reporting from Syria most recently. She's a PS21 fellow. We're keeping this in-house today. And she's launched a new podcast called Voices Unheard, which brings us stories from the Arab and Muslim world. And I highly recommend that you listen to it. Next to her is Dr. Goldstone. He's a professor of public policy at George Mason University, whose work is focused on politics, social movements, democratization, and long-term social change. His more recent work focuses on demographic changes and its impact on major global issues, including what's happening in Europe right now. He's also a member of the PS21 International Advisory Group. And then next to him is Sir Michael Leigh, the former Director General for EU Enlargement and Deputy Head of Foreign Relations. He's now a Senior Advisor at the German Marshall Fund and also a member of the PS21 International Advisory Group. So thank you all for coming and joining us today. As I was discussing before we started, many of us in the US sadly don't follow what's happening in Europe very closely. I'm including myself in that. That is until we see crises, whether it's the Greek crisis or now the migrant crisis. And in the last couple of months, we've started to see massive numbers of migrants coming, not just from Syria, though they make up 50%, I believe, of the migrants who are coming now, but also Afghanistan, Eritrea, and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa into Europe. So if we could take a moment to step back and give some context to the American audiences who may not be following as much. I wanted to start with you, Michael. Given how the EU was set up, can you give us some background on, firstly, how the EU has traditionally dealt with migrants? What are the mechanisms that make for common, what are the common legal frameworks or obligations that EU members have in terms of bringing in asylum seekers or just economic migrants? And why do we see so much difference in terms of how the countries are responding?
Well, just to describe the basic situation before coming to the present crisis. So in the European Union, there is the principle of free movement of workers among all the member states and free movement of people, not necessarily seeking a job, among the 22 European countries that are part of what is called the Schengen Convention after the small town in Luxembourg where it was agreed. And basically asylum policy is still a national responsibility, but there are certain common rules. And one of those rules until now has been that the member states individually are responsible for controlling their external borders, and that when a third country citizen arrives claiming asylum, that application needs to be dealt with in the first EU country where he or she arrives. And part of the reason for the present crisis is, given the numbers, this first rule that the member states should individually control their external borders cannot be fulfilled in practice, because the countries where most migrants are arriving, Italy and Greece, simply lack the administrative capacity to control their borders, whether in terms of Coast Guard, in terms of immigration officials, civil servants to register people when they arrive. They simply don't have the capacity. And secondly, it's clear that the idea that the first country where they arrive should be the one that considers their application for asylum is proved now simply unrealistic. And they are being shunted on from country to country Many of them have as their desired final destination Germany or Sweden, because they believe they will be better treated there, they will find it easier to get jobs, maybe they have relatives there already to some extent. So the countries which are on the path between arrival in Italy and Greece, notably, the countries in the Balkans and up into Central Europe, see these huge movements of people who are not necessarily seeking to stay in those particular countries, in Hungary or Croatia or Slovenia, but are headed for countries further north, in particular Germany and Sweden. So what we've seen is, under the pressure of these numbers, the existing rules have simply broken down. And functionally on the basis of these rules, the EU is simply unable to control the refugee flows.
Well, Jack, if you don't mind, as I said, the crisis that we see today is not new in some ways. There's been migrants who've been trying, often in very perilous journeys across the Mediterranean, to come to Europe. And you've talked about in your own work about how there's this demographic mismatch that may be at play here, where Europe sees declining populations that are aging, and you see parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Middle East, where the populations are surging, and there's been this so-called youth bulge in these societies. So could you talk about how there's a demographic pull and push that may be broader and bigger than just this crisis that we're seeing today?
That's correct. What we're seeing today in the crisis is kind of a concentration of numbers at a few vulnerable points. But I will say, I disagree a little bit with what you said about this not being new. In fact, volumes of migrants at this level coming from outside of Europe, this is new for all the Europeans who are alive today. So if you look back to the first part of this century, Europeans were sending migrants outward. And indeed, European countries have thought of themselves as places that send migrants out to the world, not as places that migrants would come and find a home. You could say, well, that seems odd. I mean, if Europeans think of migrants going out and getting a good opportunity, shouldn't they be welcoming the same way? But people don't view refugees often enough as people like themselves. And this is where your work is so important, hearing the voices of people and establishment of humanity. There is a tendency for people to think of themselves as members of communities or tribes that are bound by a common identity. Up until the 1970s, the number of non-Europeans living in European countries was really very small. If you go back to the 1950s, Great Britain had less than 100,000 blacks in the entire country. If you go back even to the 1970s, there were less than 100,000 Muslims in all of France. Now there are closer to 8 million. So the numbers have indeed grown very rapidly in the last 30 years. And that is a result of this imbalance. Populations which have been growing very rapidly in Europe for 2 centuries, from the Industrial Revolution to the 1950s, people don't realize that in 1914, the population of Europe was as large as the population of China. And Europe was sending people to South America, New Zealand, Australia, North America, wave after wave. So this was the dynamic area. But since the 1970s, Europeans have stopped having children in large numbers. They still have 1 or 2, but usually not more. But in North Africa, families continue to have 3 or 4 children. And so there's this surplus of young people, particularly since the economies in North Africa and the Middle East, even when they were growing, a lot of the benefits of that growth went to an elite that was connected to the government. Other people who aspired to more had trouble finding it. Still, people didn't pour into Europe in large numbers. People moved around the Middle East. Even now, most of the Syrian refugees are in Lebanon and Turkey. But for Europe to suddenly get several 100,000 asylum seekers and refugees from outside of Europe, it's a large enough problem that there is no mechanism in place to deal with that. It was not anticipated, and it hasn't been seen in the last 20, 30 years. And now Europe has to say, what do our values say we should do for these people as human beings? And what do our institutions allow us to do under the law? And these don't always match up very well. That's why we call it a crisis today.
I could just add something on the basis of Jack's comment in response to your first question. The countries that find themselves at odds with Germany in particular, but also Sweden, those countries who voted against the obligatory quota scheme that was approved by the EU Council of Ministers a couple of weeks ago in Central Europe, the Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia. These are countries that have not accustomed themselves to having large populations from outside of Europe living within their borders. In fact, the same applies to Eastern Germany. And part of the reason for the different response in Western Europe and in these countries, I think, can be explained by that.
Well, I have a follow-up question that speaks to both of you in some ways. There's also this argument that's out there, and I don't know how much credence we can give to it, that migrants are good for economies. And so it's not just a matter of moral obligation, it's also supposedly a win-win if you bring in, and we were talking earlier about these very highly educated, highly skilled individuals that are coming and they're hungry to work and they're not looking for handouts. So could you maybe talk about how the demographic factor can also be, how much credence can we put to this argument that it's a win-win to bring in migrants?
I think it is a win-win. There are a variety of valuable migrants for Europe. There are people who are willing to do jobs that many Europeans would prefer not to do. Construction, care for the elderly, things that are labor-intensive, don't pay that well, but are necessary simply to keep the lights on, the doors open, and people cared for. Migrants who will do that work are valuable. And then there are high-skilled migrants, people with degrees in engineering or pharmacy or medicine, who can contribute to the high-skilled labor. There are certainly rural areas of Europe that can use more doctors, more nurses, and engineers, particularly actually in Eastern European countries that are most hostile to migration. That's one of the ironies here. Right? At the same time, people are afraid of that which is not familiar. So if you ask people, do you think your country should have more immigrants who are doctors or engineers? Most people say, okay. But if you ask people, do you think your country should have more immigrants from the Middle East? Or should they have more immigrants who are Muslim? Almost immediately they'll say, no, we have too many already. Now, the reality is that the numbers are still very small. There's no European country except Russia in which Muslims are more than 8% of the population. None in which the non-European population is more than 9 or 10%. You compare that with Australia, where 22% of the population is foreign-born. You compare that with America and Canada, where it's about 17, 18%. And you'd say, well, Europe has only half. But Europe is not used to dealing with people who come from different cultures. They don't have the experience of seeing those people integrate and move into the mainstream of their societies. Germany, perhaps a bit more. They went through a real reality check when they realized the Turkish guest workers who had been in the country since the 1950s were staying and having children.
Much more.
That's right. But it was with the recognition that Germany was aging and that many of the people who had come from Turkey, their children were born in Germany, had been raised, wanted to be part of Germany and could make a contribution and wanted to be part of Germany. And Germans started to realize as long as these people want to be part of our society, we can manage that. And Germany has really, the difference between 20 years ago and today is shown in the welcome the Germans gave arriving Syrians, much different than what you see in parts of Europe that did not have to confront this issue of, yes, we've had long-term migrants, we need to integrate them. Germany has said, yes, we can do it and we will. Many other parts of Europe have not yet seen that self-interest in good light.
You have to muddy the waters just a little bit. First of all, some 25% of all the migrants arriving in the European Union this year are actually from the Balkans. And 40+% of those arriving in Germany are from the Balkans. Many of them Roma who are fleeing discrimination. This is something that is often forgotten, but is an important part of the picture. So some of the discussion in Europe now is the idea of establishing so-called safe countries of origin, and the Balkan countries, and Turkey too for that matter, many of which are candidates for EU membership, as such have been certified to respect human rights, the rule of law, and to have democratic systems. Otherwise, they wouldn't be accepted as candidates. So it's a little bit odd to accept that somebody can face a well-founded fear of persecution in a country that you have deemed to satisfy all these standards. So this is one little light motif in the discussion going on at the moment. But there's a disparity between a rational analysis of the positive contribution that migrants could make potentially, particularly in light of an aging population and the fact that the number of working age people in Germany and elsewhere is declining proportionately to the number of older people who need to be supported in some way. So you provide a rational argument for migration, which perhaps has resonance, particularly in the United States, which is a country built on migration. I must say there's some mythology in Europe as well about this, because in many European countries, including France, which is very restrictive now about taking migrants, I read that maybe 1 in 4 French people have at least one foreign-born grandparent in France. So we don't want to be too carried away with the idea of European countries as homogenous. The picture is in fact more varied than that. But the fact of the matter is, after more than 7 years now of economic recession, and with the size of the economies of several European countries, such as Italy, smaller than they were 10 years ago, with unemployment still high, and particularly youth unemployment very high, in countries like Spain approaching 50%, the whole question about migration became extremely sensitive long before this particular crisis. And what we've seen in Europe over the last decade, unfortunately, is the growth of political parties whose main platform is opposition to immigration, sometimes a more toxic mix with elements of racism and anti-Semitism in those parties as well. And several of these parties more recently trying to sort of detoxify their image from this by becoming anti-EU, public opinion, than being overtly racist. So this crisis comes on top of a situation in which the free movement of workers in the EU has already alarmed people about migration, the larger numbers than expected of Polish and Lithuanian workers, for example. In France, you remember the controversies about Polish plumbers and so on. In the UK, the mythology of welfare tourism, the idea that foreigners are coming to claim welfare benefits. In fact, the study prepared by the Home Office in the UK, the Ministry of the Interior in the UK, which was meant to demonstrate the number of welfare tourists, was suppressed because it didn't demonstrate anything of the kind. Most people coming to the UK are coming there in order to work. And these populist political parties are no longer marginal. And we see in a number of countries, France, the National Front, if things don't change, the National Front candidate, Marine Le Pen, could win at least the first round of the French presidential election in 2017, an openly anti-immigrant, anti-EU political party. And in countries that were famed for their tolerance and openness, like the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, we also see these parties either in government or helping to form a majority, which permits the government to govern. In Germany, we've seen recently demonstrations organized by Pegida, which is a recent political grouping opposed openly to Muslims in the West, coupled with incidents of violence. Because one of the striking things in Europe over the last decade, despite these enormously high unemployment figures and the continuing recession, is there's been very little violence until now. It's mainly been contained within the parliamentary or democratic system, whereas now we're seeing some alarming incidents of violence, immigrant homes and residences set fire to in Germany and so on. So however persuasive on demographic grounds, the arguments are that migration, including highly educated migrants of the kind that we're seeing coming now from Syria, that this could be a win-win and a positive contribution, the political climate is not very supportive.
Let me just amplify that. I don't think it can be stressed enough that this migration crisis is not a demographic crisis. That European Union has 500 million inhabitants. To ask it to absorb 1 million in some combination from Syria, the Balkans, is not a huge demand. I mean, part of the problem is tens of thousands are coming to a few small islands owned by Greece or Italy because the travel avenues have gotten clogged and constricted. That's a technical problem. Settling one person for 500 per year is a technical problem. Those are easy. It's not the demographics. The real problem is political. And politics is all about decision-making. And in Europe, there is national decision-making and EU-level decision-making. And these two are not in harmony right now because the politics of migration are different in different countries. And the politics are not rational. They're driven by anxieties that have been fed by the last 7 years of economic recession and by some of the traumas that accompanied EU integration and the movement of Europeans within Europe. And that has been indeed a significant number. People have had adjustment issues with that. In a sense, this crisis is too soon. After dealing with the recession, dealing with internal border restrictions being dropped, now on top of that, a noticeable number of non-Europeans knocking on the doors, or Europeans from areas like Serbia and Romania that are not felt to be the same as Western Europeans. This has become a straw that's been too harsh for many, but it is a political issue at heart.
I would just qualify that to say that although 1 in 500...
We're close, but not fully.
Well, listen, we want to have a discussion here.
And before we go too far down the European, I do want to explain why there are Syrians coming, and then we can bring the two together. So, so maybe we can turn it to Russia. I mean, the civil war in Syria has been going on now for over 4, we're getting to 4 years. Over 4 years, close to 5 years. And we know that the so-called Islamic State has played a role, and now we see increased violence because of Russia's interventions. So can you talk about why this type of migration is happening into Europe now, given that this struggle has been going on for a while, and countries like Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan have been absorbing quite a few?
Yeah, well, if I may just follow up on your discussion, there's something that that's really important to mention with regards to why it's so different, migration to Europe versus migration in the US. There's a certain rigidity in Europe. For example, France, they have a very rigid idea of laïque. So the entire conversation about whether or not to let migrants in or about the Muslim minority there can be reduced to where a woman can wear her headscarf or not. There's also rigidity in terms of finding employment in Europe in general, perhaps with the exception of Germany and the UK, but it's very difficult once you hire someone, it's very difficult to fire them. Here it's sort of very flexible. I find the refugees that I've met here, for example, they arrive within 3 months of arrival, they are expected to be self-sufficient. They end up driving a cab. I met refugees that are waiting to sign up with Uber. It takes a year, they tell me, to have a license, a U.S. driver's license before you can drive with Uber. So in the meantime, they borrowed $1,000, bought a car, and they're doing pizza delivery in the meantime. If they have a degree, they're trying to adjust it and work in their field. And immediately within months they feel they're part of the system. Nobody asks them questions like, "Are you French?" Nobody says that to them here. So it's a very sort of different environment. But back to Syria, and now with the Russian airstrikes, basically the latest news is that the Russian airstrikes have now contributed to a new wave of refugees that are fleeing from Aleppo to Turkey. Now, a lot of the refugees that have gone to Europe in this latest wave over this past summer and even the summer before had already been spending a lot of time in Lebanon, Turkey, not so much Jordan because it's difficult to be smuggled out of Jordan to Europe, but mostly Lebanon and Turkey. And these are people who, a lot of them left thinking it would just be a matter of days, maybe a matter of weeks before they can return to their home in Syria. I think Arabs in general, and certainly Syrians today, call it the Palestinian syndrome. They all remember when Palestinians left their homes, thinking it would be a matter of days, and here they are 60 years later. So a lot of Syrians did not want to be in that position. They did not want to leave their home in the first place. And when they left, they figured, okay, definitely just a few more days and we'll get back. And they couldn't. They just couldn't. They got stuck where they were, tried to make it work. I've met a lot of Syrians, for example, living in, say, Tripoli, northern Lebanon, or even Beirut, middle class or, lower income background. They sell their belongings, whatever they have, whatever gold the woman happens to have with her. If it's not stolen, of course, which happens a lot in the refugee camps or even in the hotel rooms. Frankly, it's become an industry. Theft preying on the fleeing Syrian refugees, the middle-class refugees. Some of them sold their cars, sold their home if they could get a decent price for it, and just burnt through that cash living in Lebanon or Turkey. And then once that's done and their home is sold, where to go from there? They can't go back to their hometown. So it's just, scrambling to come up with the cost to be smuggled. And one main reason that we saw this past summer, there was such a large wave of refugees is because the prices for smugglers went down. Partly because the demand was so high, volume, yes. And then I remember over the course of the past 4 years, there would be, for example, rumors, the easiest way to get to Europe is from Libya or from Algeria. So that was very difficult for a lot of Syrians to get there. Then Egypt opened up to Syrians. A lot of them moved there, but then it kind of closed down on them. There was a smuggler route from Alexandria, Egypt, which was very popular for a while, but then it shut down. The Egyptian Coast Guard even arrested Syrians, and as far as I know, some of them still linger in prison there. So then new routes opened out of Turkey, and that's been the case for the past 2 years. It's actually very inexpensive.
There are even people who want to avoid the dangerous sea route and will take a land route up to the Finnish border.
Yes.
Called the Arctic route.
Through Russia, yes.
But what this tells you is that people have given up on being able to have a life unless they move. The refugee camps, which initially were designed to give shelter, were not designed to be permanent residences. A lot of the emergency aid is now not being increased, but reduced. And so even rations in some of the camps have been reduced. And people are getting the message. People who had education and careers and aspirations, if they want to build a life for themselves and their children, they need to go to some place like Europe where they can do that. Otherwise, the Palestinian future may live indefinitely. That's the big fear.
Yeah, and then volume sort of gave rise to more volume, because as prices dropped, then people who were living inside Syria, they had not been displaced or had been displaced internally, decided, what, let's just do it. I mean, this is crazy. It's not getting any better here. If you have male children who are coming of age, your parents are very, very worried that your son is going to be drafted the next time he just goes out on an errand or comes back from college. And it's the same problem under ISIS rule as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, it's gotten to this sort of pivotal point where it's better to leave. For many, it's better to leave than stay at home. This is the people who are still at home, or just slightly internally displaced. What I mean by slightly internally displaced is just literally from one neighborhood to another neighborhood within Damascus, for example, which is very, very common.
And I'm going to ask you one more question about sort of the experience of moving as well. We talked about these first round of countries that are absorbing these refugees, Croatia or the Balkan states or Italy and Greece, that are having a very hard time taking this tremendous volume. And in some ways, as the weather gets worse, we're seeing pretty horrific humanitarian issues happening in these countries, or people being penned in and not being given food or water in the Hungarian case. Can you talk a little bit about what even the experience of, once you get to Europe, sort of in your conversations with people, what that's been like?
Yeah, it's funny. They all. It depends on when you get in touch with them, where they are on the road to their final destination, and they're all in constant contact with family and friends through the internet or whatever, through their phone, WhatsApp, and Viber, which I know came as a surprise to many Europeans, but that's just the world we live in today. So they say that they're completely outside their element. They're like, oh, we've seen things we never even could have dreamt of. We've just crossed the sea. Someone drowned next to me. This woman I met disappeared in the sea. Just these stories that, frankly, after a while become too much for your mind to process. And when you get in touch with these refugees, they're often focused on the immediate needs, like today, where I will find shelter, where I will find food, and how will I get to my next destination? Will I catch this train to Macedonia, and on and on. But once they get to their final destination, it doesn't matter what it looks like. A couple of days ago, I spoke to refugees that I personally know, that I've known for years from Damascus. They've been displaced in Lebanon for 3 years, a young couple without children, and they finally decided to take the plunge. They went from Turkey to Greece and on and on. Very difficult trip, took maybe over 2 weeks. Finally, when they got to Germany, they sent me a picture of a tent. And they're like, we're in a camp in Germany. We're so relieved. Here's our lovely tent. This is like, they're middle class. They had a car and a home, everything. They thought they would spend the rest of their lives in Syria 4 years ago. So now they're very happy to be living in a tent because they just arrived in Germany. That's basically the migration experience. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Michael, going back to you, and you were starting, I think, to get to this point, but it's perhaps a combination of these political issues that you bring up, but also resources issues that are not necessarily giving the resources at these frontline, sort of, I'm calling them, for lack of a better word, countries. Can you talk about how wealthier countries like Germany are trying to play a role on that end of the crisis, and maybe even going into countries like Turkey? You wrote an article today about how Angela Merkel just went to Turkey and is trying to sort of mitigate the issue before it gets to the borders of Europe. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the impact globally, I agree, 1 in 500 is not enormous, but they're tremendously concentrated in certain areas. And disproportionate demands are placed on those administrations. And it's this, I think, that's giving rise to such problems right now. These are very real problems. I mean, a large number of migrants come to a particular municipality. There's one school, there's one a community center. These are made available for temporary accommodation. They can't then be used for their original purpose. The inhabitants find themselves in difficulty, stress develops, and so on. And there are areas within Germany, like Bavaria, because of its geographic situation, it's in the front line for receiving migrants. And just as the EU tried to reach an agreement, in fact was decided by majority vote to impose quotas on different member states, so within Germany, they tried to reach such an agreement between the different states, the different Länder in Germany, but it's been impossible to implement in practice. So while globally, indeed, we should be able to absorb these kind of numbers, in the concentrations where you find them in particular areas, there are very specific short to medium term problems. That's for real. Now, what the EU most needs to do, and what the European Commission is proposing, is that the countries which are not frontline countries should provide resources to the countries that are in the front line to begin with. So it means helping them to control their borders. It means patrolling the seas to try and pick up migrants who are in danger of their lives. Until now, this has been left very much to the Italian and Greek Coast Guard to a very limited extent. It means providing administrative backup for handling all of this and money. The problem is it's very hard to get this organized quickly at European level. There's a new operation called Sophia, which is named after a little baby girl who was born on a rescue ship. But what does Sophia amount to until now? 6 naval vessels that have been provided by other member states to help the Italians cope with the 20+ vessels that leave Libya every day. So this is a drop in the ocean, literally, and they're not able to rescue everybody who is out there on the sea. But it's this kind of joint effort that is underway. Now, you mentioned Turkey. The Turkish president visited Brussels 10 days ago, and the EU member states proposed a kind of joint action plan with Turkey, whereby Turkey would do more to try and filter the refugees and or asylum claimants and economic migrants within Turkey itself. Only a few of these are in camps, by the way. The overwhelming majority are living in Turkish cities, particularly in the southeast, posing other questions in terms of population balance and so on in these areas. Turkey will do more to try and control these flows. Many of these migrants are coming into the EU across the Turkish-Greek border. And in exchange for that, the EU would provide further funding for Turkey, would speed up its talks about possible future membership, and also would speed up arrangements to help Turks visit the EU with fewer formalities. And there would be a kind of package deal. And Merkel went off to Istanbul to try and seal this deal. But I'm afraid the will is not really there on either side. There's a lot of mutual mistrust. On the EU side, people are very struck by the human rights violations in Turkey, the number of writers, journalists in prison there, various other rule of law problems. And the Turks are very suspicious about the EU, have been holding them at arm's length for years while promising membership in the end. So I'm not sure that the real basis for trust is there. So what we see now is an effort simply to coordinate national efforts. There's an EU agency called Frontex that ought to be controlling the borders itself. It really doesn't have the resources for that. Instead, it's just trying to coordinate national activities. So the European Commission has made proposals, but frankly, in the short run, I don't see either the resources or the political will for a truly European effort.
Well, Sir Michael Leigh is going to have to leave shortly, so I wanted to ask the audience if you had any questions of him before he heads out. Yes, please. Could you identify yourself and because it's recording?
Okay. My name is Lisa. I'm Swedish, I'm a filmmaker. My question is, in Sweden there's been a debate about, I'm very proud of us taking in a lot of refugees. There's worry among some people that taking in more people is making more people take the journey, and the dangerous journey. And is there more that could be done to help people make the journey instead? Like, actually go and get refugees and not like only get the people who are able to afford and make the journey.
Yes, Sweden is making a huge effort. I saw the figure today of 180,000 this year, which for a country Sweden's size is enormous, and apparently some $7 or $8 billion, which is a huge amount for a country like Sweden to have spent on all of this. So can something be done to help facilitate the journey, that it should be in less degrading conditions? Yes. I do think that this could be one of the focuses, and there have been some limited efforts to do that with trains and buses provided so that people can cross the transit country, not having to do these huge route marches on the 40 kilometers from their point of arrival to the main town. Now buses have been provided by a kind of common European effort. So more can be done along these lines. But one has to face the fact that there is reluctance to do that. And that countries like Sweden and Germany that have been making these kind of efforts are more and more contested by others who we're in a sort of vicious circle here. Because the more that is done to welcome refugees and to make the passage easier, the more countries like the Central European countries, the Balkan countries, feel that an open invitation is being given and that this will provide an incentive. And when you look at the rather inhuman treatment provided in the Czech Republic, for example, and the razor wire fence and so on built in Croatia, the pretended justification for this to some extent is that it's meant to discourage further migrants. So in terms of the will to do this, it's limited. And people are very concerned that if they do more to facilitate transit, this will be an open invitation for more to come. But this really does need to be dealt with at European level. We need to have a common approach. There's going to be a summit with all the Balkan countries next week. The EU is groping towards a common approach, but it's not proving easy.
Stanley Kober, a couple points. First, on the economy, the idea win-win. As Sir Michael mentioned, you already have very high youth unemployment in Europe, 20%. This is the best educated generation Europe has ever had, and a lot of them are leaving. I mean, you look at the figures from Ireland, for example, they're stunning. You're having a replacement now, in effect, of young Europeans leaving, and in effect now being replaced by these new refugees. But some solution has to be found for the youth unemployment. I think there was a speech last summer by Christine Lagarde that I don't think got a lot of attention, in which she said Europe's survival was the word she used, is at stake because of this problem of youth unemployment. And then she added, solutions remain to be found. Managing director of the IMF is not sure what to do. This is a real problem. I mean, down the road, given the demographic problems, the situation may turn out to be a blessing for Europe. But there's a lot of time between now and then. And how you get from here to there, I am really not sure. So that's the economy problem. We might want to come back. That may be the subject for a future meeting. But also, this may just be the first wave. Now they're arriving because of violence and bad economies, okay? I don't see the violence diminishing. If anything, it seems to be getting worse. Bad economies, take a look at the IMF's report on the Gulf just issued. But there's a third reason that hasn't been mentioned, and that's climate change. It's not just rising sea levels that could lead to refugees. It's desertification. People will move. What happens then if people start moving as a result of climate change?
Why don't you take the first time?
Yeah, I could respond rather briefly. I think this point about drought and climate change maybe is relevant to some of the migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and from East Africa, where this is exacerbating existing problems of poverty and income inequality. I think that's definitely an issue. The very high levels of youth unemployment are a huge social, political, and economic problem in Europe. In the country where I've lived for the largest part of my adult life, Belgium, you ask young people these days what they do for a profession. Very often they're going to say in French, moi je chôme, I'm unemployed. My professional activity is being unemployed. We know also that particularly in some of the deprived areas around the large cities in France, you're into third generation, in some cases having no job, where the second generation had no job. And therefore the role models and so on are such that delinquency becomes very common. And as we know, many of the European so-called jihadis have been radicalized in prison, where they've been put for petty crimes, and then they've met more radical figures in jail. So all of this tends to exacerbate the different crises. I think what we are seeing is that the many crises that Europe is facing at the moment, the Euro crisis that has not been solved, the question of migration, we haven't yet touched on Ukraine, Russia, but that's another one. And briefly, the UK was mentioned and the possibility of the UK withdrawing from the European Union. The migration crisis is exacerbating all these other crises. And in terms of the economy, we've already seen some governments, for example, claiming that the EU, they're spending on refugees, which is seen as partly genuine and partly a way just to escape some of the tougher rules that are being applied in the Eurozone. So these are very complex issues which unfortunately are reinforcing each other.
The youth unemployment problem in the EU is a real danger to the future of Europe, and it is a genuine problem. However, it began in 2007. Its cause had nothing to do with rising international migration. So there's no reason to think that international migration, if it increases, would make that problem worse. They are unrelated. The youth unemployment, first of all, it's not universal. Countries that have good apprentice programs like Germany and the Netherlands have far less of a problem. Countries like Italy and Spain, where people went into construction booms during the time of easy credit, and then when the construction boom ended after the recession, people are thrown out of work. They don't have the skills. People who do have the skills have been migrating to Germany and such to look for work. If immigrants enter a country and need housing, they will provide a demand for the construction skills and for the empty estates that were left behind. They actually can make an immediate positive impact on this youth unemployment issue. What people overlook, all of our institutions are built for a world in which the youth cohorts are the base of a large pyramid. As they grow up, they need new houses, they need new roads, they need new offices, and older people should retire and people move up. But we're now in a different world where the age pyramids have inverted. There are large numbers of people in their 50s and 60s who are hard to fire, who are holding on to their jobs in a difficult economic climate. And there's no incentive for companies to hire additional people. And if additional people aren't being hired, young people can't get jobs. So the way to deal with this is to create more demand. But the austerity policies and the exclusion of migration have actually made the youth unemployment problem worse. So these are essentially two problems that could help solve each other. But again, politically, people say we have youth unemployment, immigrants take jobs, therefore it'll make it worse. It's an illusion. It's just not true. As far as the political issue, though, the real sad thing is that Europe is beset with multiple crises. They have a currency that was not established to deal with uneven debt issues. So you have a situation where there's no unified credit mechanism, and countries that ran up big debts in euros have a problem. They can't devalue their currency. You have an asylum and migration policy that has certain EU characteristics, but was not set up to deal with the sudden influx in certain countries who have first responsibility. So this kind of transitional institutional setup in Europe has now been unfortunately hit by a global recession in 2007, massive Middle East wars in Libya and Syria that generate refugees, and continuing tensions with Russia, the demographic adjustment that people are only starting to appreciate. And this collection of crises has produced fear that the right-wing extremist parties are using to gain strength. We should be able, I hope, to turn this around and say, let's remember values, let's be humanitarian. If we help each other, we'll emerge stronger. But that's a voice that you hear from some people. The voice of fear is also very strong. And the fear of being overwhelmed by multiple crises is something that only rational discourse, I hope, can help us escape.
I'm going to ask a question about policy that
and I just want to say something about climate change indeed. I mean, I'm already seeing academic studies sort of blaming climate change, at least partly, for the Arab Spring, and certainly in Syria, desertification was a problem in eastern Syria, and over the past decade leading up to the uprising in Syria, the Assad government underestimated its impact and sort of ignored it, but it was was a very, very big problem percolating, and it contributed to the uprising for sure.
Yeah, I was going to transition to, unless there's another question from the audience for Mr. Michael Leigh. I was going to ask you a question about policy and sort of go around, and then at whatever point you need to leave, you can leave. But what should the policy response be of, I'm going to say, the powerful countries in Europe, Britain, France, Germany? What should be the response that can turn this crisis around and sort of bring the positive aspects that you keep highlighting? What is the policy response?
At the risk of some simplification and going beyond Europe, I think there needs to be a triple response. The first area of response needs to be what is being called the root causes of the movement of migrants today. The second area of response, I think, needs to be what the EU should be doing to give itself a genuinely European policy and capacity to act on the issues that we've been discussing. And the third that you might like to continue to discuss, and can't remain with you unfortunately till the end, is a global response. Because even though the source of some of the migration are countries which are directly geographically neighbors of the European Union, this is not always the case. One source of refugees is Afghanistan coming into Europe right now. And I think that there's also a global dimension to all of this. And just taking really very briefly, I think that on the root causes, we've mentioned some of them. The most evident one in the short term concerns Syria and the failure over the last 3 or 4 years of either the United States or the European countries or the Gulf countries to come up with any kind of diplomatic, let alone military strategy for coping with the problem. So it's a bit late now, but perhaps it's not too late. So I do think there needs to be a concerted effort to address this problem at its root. The precise nature of the solution could be discussed. But I think, as with many international conflicts, the main elements of what a solution would be have been known for some years. And what is lacking is the political will until now to pursue. And then I think the issues in each country of origin need to be tackled, whether income inequality, whether increasing development assistance, whether dealing with climate change, or whether conflict prevention and conflict management and conflict resolution in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya, coping with problems of dysfunctional democracy, state failure. Very easy to list these root causes, much harder to indicate what should be done. But as both the Europeans and the Americans have claimed over the last decade to have policies designed for this purpose, these policies need to be re-examined and something more needs to be done. The second area, I think we described what I think the EU should be doing, having a genuinely European approach, a European force beefing up Frontex, having better coastal protection, processing legal applications for refugees much more quickly, applied to the countries of origin more quickly than has been done now, so that administrations can deal with those who do have a right under the various refugee conventions to be in the countries concerned. So a genuinely European response. And at the global level, I do think that countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Gulf countries in particular, Japan and others, need, as they did in the 70s and 80s, for example, in response to the Vietnam boat people, to try and come up with a global effort. I know how difficult it is. There are always elections down the road. There are no votes to be gained. How difficult it is in the US, simply increasing the number from 2,000 to 10,000 for Syrian refugees. But I think the problem is on such a scale that there needs to be a global response as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Excuse me if I...
No, it's okay, but we'll continue the conversation. But I want to turn to you, Rasha. Like, the root cause issue is just so difficult, and we could probably do 20 sessions on what's happening in Syria right now. But can you talk about, from a perspective of a migration issue, from the perspective of the migration issue, what should the policy response of European countries be, from your perspective, in terms of Syria? Should they be dealing with the root cause?
Yeah. You know, having been on the ground pretty much from the beginning and even before, and seeing it sort of lead to that, and having witnessed the war in Iraq as well, Syria is the first conflict in the history of humanity that unfolds in real time and before the entire world because of social media, because of what was available. From day one, the entire world was able to watch what was going on. You know, but unfortunately, also from day one, it seemed there was a lot of denial. So I'm not a policymaker, and that's really way above my pay grade. But I can tell you the one problem that I think has contributed to this from policymakers is their denial. And it's not going to go away. It's going to continue, and it's just deteriorating. There's going to be more refugees when spring comes around. You better believe that, you know, prices of smugglers are still going to be cheap, and there's still going to be a great deal of demand. A lot of the refugees that have arrived in Europe and asked for asylum are going to be bringing their families, so their numbers are going to be multiplying. You know, and now here we go again. For example, there's a war in Yemen also unfolding in real time and right before our eyes, and everyone is just sort of ignoring it. Well, it will come back to bite everybody. You know, we will start hearing about the crisis of Yemen refugees and the devastated country that's being there. So it's not something we can just keep turning a blind eye to.
Yeah. And I read an article yesterday in The Atlantic, I believe it was a professor from George Mason as well, who said, we're not going to solve the Syria crisis, so the least we can do is open borders and let the refugees in. How do you both feel about that argument?
The complexity of the Syrian crisis has become enormous. If it were just a local civil war, one could perhaps negotiate among the parties involved, even though there are many. But it's become a local civil war that is overlaid with the broader Shia versus Sunni conflict in the broader Middle East. It's become tied up with the national interests of Turkey, which does not want to see a Kurdish state on its border and wants to see Assad deposed. The national interests of Iran, who wants to see Assad remain in power, and the interests of Saudi Arabia, which immediately in Yemen, but also in Syria, would prefer to see a Sunni majority in control. And then in addition to these national interests, we now have global interests of countries like Russia and the United States, who are also giving arms and support to different actors. So with all of these issues to sort out, it's very difficult to see how the Syrian conflict can be resolved. And indeed, the Syrian conflict can't be separated from the rise of ISIS, which spills into Iraq and is also a multinational problem. So I think one has to be realistic and say that the war in Syria will very likely go on for some years until such time as the national and global players feel it's important to come to an agreement and help impose a settlement. In that time, what do? Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey are already taking far more refugees. It's important for the world to contribute financially so that they can survive and also support their integration into their societies. Because right now, no one in the world except the UN Commission speaks for migrants. They have no rights. Sometimes they're not allowed to work in countries where they're in refugee camps. Sometimes they're not allowed to earn any kind of income or receive an income, or the income is preyed upon. So the migrants need to be supported and given more opportunities to make a life for themselves where they have settled. And then should Europe open its doors as much as possible, recognizing the kind of win-win. And the reality, climate change is a big impersonal force, and climate change does create burdens. But people are running away from barrel bombs and cluster bombs. They're running away from the abuse of their governments. And it is part of the responsibility of all nations under the Human Rights Convention to give support to people whose basic right to survive is being threatened. by governments that do not offer them that protection. So I think there's no doubt that even though it is politically contentious and difficult, there's a worse risk of terrorist blowback if Europe is harsh to potential refugees. There's a worse risk of conflict spreading if efforts to settle refugees in countries are not strong. You look at the conflict between Israel and Palestine on for 60 years, a large part of that is because the Palestinian refugees were in Israel or outside, and their limbo, their dilemma, their suffering has contributed to that crisis for decades. We don't want that to happen again.
And I'm going to open it up to questions, but if you just want to briefly
Yeah,
respond
and
to that as well.
and that is certainly what's happening and what will continue to happen. And I sort of agree with some of your points, but I disagree that it's become so complicated that it's sort of maybe beyond redemption. I don't think it's sort of a, you know, this crazy Sunni Shia war that no one can really help. I think every party in the conflict in Syria answers to somebody, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Turkey or Iran or, you know, now Russia or CIA trained, the like 5 people that are trained by the CIA. But I think it's very possible to get all those parties to somehow you know, somehow come together and come up with a solution. I don't think Iran or Saudi Arabia are happy with ISIS running amok. ISIS thrives on any area that has a power vacuum, wherever there's chaos. The US, actually one big question that remains unanswered for me is, you know, us lowly journalists were on the ground before ISIS came to be, and we saw it sort of come out of the shadows and take 1/3 of Syria and 1/3 of Iraq virtually overnight. And how is it that us people on the ground, along with the local activists and the rebels and so on, we knew exactly what was going on. We saw what was coming, maybe not too far in advance. But how is it that we knew this was going to happen and the US didn't? Or, I mean, it's just really bizarre to me. I mean, it's strange that that ISIS managed to take over 1/3 of Syria and 1/3 of Iraq so quickly. But, you know, according to the Obama administration, it's going to take years to roll it back. It's just very strange. So I think there's a lack of resolve. There's sort of a lack of, you know, real motivation to resolve this issue.
I realize I got here late. My wife and I just returned from Hungary, working for the Interior Ministry just yesterday, and we were up at the Austro-Hungarian border. And we, my wife also has a humanitarian aid organization. We delivered jackets and food to approximately 5,000 migrants at the time. And I have to say that it was quite unlike we were expecting in terms of people they were so grateful, and they were just, it really tugged at your heartstrings. And it's one thing, you know, to look at the newscasts and look at, you know, what's going on with the internet on the angry young men, but we didn't see any of that. And we saw primarily grateful families that were destitute. And incidentally, there were people from Kurdistan, Afghanistan, obviously Syria, and Iraq. How they ever got through Syria, I'll never know. But whole families just fleeing the general condition. And a lot of them, I mean, they actually took the time to learn thank you in English. And the remarkable thing in our experience was knowing that there's really no official diplomatic response that's cohesive. And as well, what we, coincidentally, I was reading Potsdam, the Conference of Potsdam right after World War II. And they were dealing with something way more insurmountable than what's occurring now in the Middle East. And we were just struck by how everyone was there in a disorganized effort, various NGOs, various individuals from communities in Hungary that were countering the official, the official hands-off procedures that the military or the police established there. And the remarkable thing, I couldn't agree more with what I've been hearing so far, that there's no official cohesive response to this tragedy right now. So.
And also a piece of what you just said that I think is also interesting is the role of the media and how when a young Kurdish boy washed up on the shore, there was suddenly Alan, escaping me, Kurdi, that makes sense. When he came on shore and everyone saw that image, it just brought everybody into the issue. So maybe if you, Rasha, since you're a journalist, like what role has media played in both creating false narratives about the people who are coming and as sort of maybe these dangerous people who are coming to come and take over Europe, but also the reverse of how it's mobilized action?
Yeah, you know, unfortunately, I'm kind of, you know, maybe I've been doing this a little too long, but it feels sometimes that a lot of my colleagues, journalist colleagues, risk a lot to get, you know, the human story that will hopefully move the audience. But it seems that fatigue is inevitable with this story, and frankly, when we're covering it and it's constantly the same story over and over and over and over again, and this is the 5th year, and the response is the same sort of, you know, general, oh wow, disaster, what can we do, war is bad, and that's pretty much the extent of the response. It becomes a little bit exhausting. So I'm afraid I can't offer a very rosy, I'm quite pessimistic these days, so that's all.
Do we have any last questions?
Rima Hebrawi, Syrian American research analyst. I just was curious to know your thoughts on the relationship with Assad and Putin and the Syria-Russia kind of relationship that's unfolded over time in terms of how that support is always there, although not necessarily for Assad, but recently it's gotten more reinforced towards him. Just your thoughts.
Yeah, actually, that's been sort of a point of obsession for me over the past, you know, 4 or 5 years trying to crack it. And frankly, when I was in the region, I tried very, very hard to sort of get inside the circles of the Russian diplomats who were generally secretive and enigmatic and won't mingle with anyone else unless there's lots of vodka around. And I did find myself a few times actually in their company, and frankly, when they're relaxed, they reveal a sort of like a sense of indifference toward Assad. Like, yeah, you know, they don't think he's managed it really well. They're kind of, you know, they made some comments about the chemical attack that was a little bit overboard and you know, that sort of thing. But when it comes down to it with the Russians, I find the bottom line is we're not going to give Syria to America. I mean, that's basically the bottom line. It's not about Assad. And frankly, nobody is indispensable. And we've seen this with the former Ukrainian Russian allies. So I mean, I think the Russians, this is my own analysis, have gone in just for their own, you know, we're not going to give this to America, and we're kind of going to show some muscle, and we're going to build on this base that we already have in Syria. I think they can take or leave Assad as long as they can maintain some sort of status quo that's in their interest. That's my reading based on post-vodka conversations.
I think Russia has many obvious reasons to be engaged. People are kind of puzzled. Why are they taking risks? Well, Syria has been an ally of Russia for the last 30 years. They've been their best, most consistent ally in the region. Russia has its only Mediterranean base there. So it's an asset that Russia wouldn't want to let slip. So what happened in the last month is that the rebels really did start to close in on parts of the Aleppo-Damascus highway. And the fear with Assad is that his own people are not that attached to him either. And if his regime starts to look like it may slip, then a lot of people will desert and it will quickly unravel. And Russia does not want to see what happened in Libya or even in Ukraine happen in Syria, where the regime suddenly falls apart, its naval base, its assets, all of that suddenly goes up in smoke. So Russia wants to see some kind of orderly transition. I agree they're not terribly attached to Assad. They don't have a better solution at the moment. But they want to stabilize Assad's control of the regions that are important so that Russia can have a say in Syria's future. They don't want Syria's future to either be collapsed or decided by America, so it's vital for them to do something. Now, once they do something, well, let's say that we're fighting terrorists. Maybe then we can get the West to go with us and see that it's not going to make our relationship with them worse. There is a real threat in Russia of Islamic terrorism. They've had incidents in Moscow and elsewhere. Somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 Russian Muslims may have joined ISIS. The numbers are impossible to tell, but those are the intelligence estimates. And so there's a lot of fear that if turmoil gets worse in the region, it'll blow back to Russia. So Russia feels, rightly or wrongly, maybe wrongly, but they feel that they can at least keep things from getting worse by supporting the Assad regime. They'd love to see a more stable regime eventually, as long as it is still an ally of theirs. Whether it's Assad or someone else, I think, is irrelevant. And Assad is a bit of a loose cannon. But China has supported North Korea regardless of even crazier and more dangerous leaders, because you have to deal with the ally you have and not the ally you'd like to have.
Just real quick, I'd ask, who is the alternative to Assad? I mean, from the US standpoint, not from.
Well, from the US standpoint, the hope was that the elite professional and business class in Syria would somehow coalesce around an emergent leadership group, create a government in opposition. That government in opposition would reach out to disenchanted military and militia groups and create an alternative force. So that was the dream. The reality is, once America tried to work with Syrian professionals in exile, they couldn't get them to agree on a leader among themselves. They argued too much over who was going to control what on the day that Assad left. I talked to people who were just deeply frustrated. These, the Syrians of different regions, different faiths, different outlooks, different interests, couldn't put all that aside and say, let's work together. But you see the difficulty in Iraq the same way. Syria is a deeply multi-ethnic, multi-regional society. The Assad family dictatorship held this together with military force. It's not so easy to make a cooperative democracy out of it. So the effort to build a government in exile has failed. The effort to train kind of a alternative liberal force has failed because ISIS, al-Nusra, and other ideologically committed groups look like they're more effective. And so that's where the effort has gone.
Also, realistically speaking, anyone who could have been a viable alternative to Assad would have been killed very early on by the Assad regime. And chances are his brother-in-law among them, he was assassinated very early on in the conflict. Many people thought he would have been a very viable alternative, and that he had contacts with outsiders or whatnot. But he was assassinated very early on. And frankly, anyone else who's viable to be exiled or imprisoned. So that's part of the problem. And also, I don't think the problem is that, you know, Syria is so diverse and multi-ethnic and all that, and therefore it's difficult to find consensus. I think the problem is because of the history of the country and the region, there's sort of a distrust in the process. So when different parties come together and they're trying to work together and elect a leader, everybody sort of, you know, unconsciously seems to believe that, oh my gosh, this one got elected, that means we're gonna be stuck with this guy forever. No, that's not gonna work. We can't have it. It has to be someone from our side. So, you know, it needs to be sort of part of the national psyche that, okay, it's okay, you lost this time, but trust the process, work with it, and next time you'll do better, or you'll get your message across. That's, the country isn't there yet. The people, the mentality isn't there yet.
Well, the lesson I take from this is that the Syria issue is going to be incredibly complex, and we should have an entire event on that, I believe. But thank you all for coming today, and we can do more casual conversation for a few more minutes. So thank you all for coming, and thank you both for
Thank you.
Thank you
Pleasure
for
to be here.
moderating this. Sure. Thanks.